descriptions of Jesus' birth in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke are actually really quite different. And there's three areas that you can look at these differences. The first is the general shape of the story. So both of the Gospel writers are agreed that Jesus was born in Bethlehem and that he grew up later on in Nazareth. But the way in which they incorporate these two towns into their stories is completely different. So Matthew, for example, has the Holy Family already living in Bethlehem. So Jesus is just born at home. Matthew's problem then is how to get Jesus back up to Nazareth. And he does that by way of the story about Herod wanting to kill the children and the Holy Family having to go into Egypt first. And then later they settle in Nazareth because they hear bad stories about Herod's son Archelaus. Luke, though, has a very different problem. He has the Holy Family living ordinarily in Nazareth in Galilee, and his difficulty is how to get the family down to Bethlehem. And he does that by way of the story of the census. So Mary goes along with Joseph down to Bethlehem because this is the ancestral home of Joseph, and the baby is born there rather unexpectedly, and there's no space for them anywhere else, so he's born in a stable. And then Luke's difficulty is that he now has to get the family back up to Nazareth, and he does that simply because the census is now at an end. So the shape of these two stories is really very different within the two Gospels. There's also a difference between the two of them in terms of the date at which Jesus was born. So if you look at Matthew's Gospel, he's clearly born before the end of the reign of Herod the Great. And we know from other sources, particularly Josephus, that Herod died around about 4 BCE. So to give time for Herod to want to kill the toddlers, all of 2 years and below, then that means that Jesus must have been born at the latest at 6 BCE. If you turn to Luke's Gospel, though, he incorporates Jesus' story with the census under Quirinius that, again, we know from other sources, took place in 6 CE, 6 AD, at the time when Judea became a Roman province. And so we have actually 11 or 12 years between these two stories. That's quite a long gap, really. And again, putting those two together, trying to harmonise them, is actually quite difficult. A third area in which the two stories are really at variance is in terms of the general themes that they encapsulate. And what's interesting here is that both Gospels almost provide a mini gospel in these first opening 2 chapters. And so all of the themes that are later going to come up in those Gospels occur already in these birth stories. So once again, to start with Matthew is very keen to show that Jesus is a second Moses. So the birth of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel very much echoes the birth of Moses at the beginning of the Exodus story, with Herod cast as the evil Pharaoh who wants to get rid of the children. And in fact, if you read stories of the birth of Moses from the 1st century, Josephus, for example, has one. The similarities with Matthew's birth stories are even more pronounced. The stories of visits of magi, of scribes checking scriptures. So any 1st century reader or hearer encountering this story would immediately think, this is Moses all over again. Matthew is also very interested in showing the kingly nature of Jesus, and he's keen to show him as king, as the son of David, king of the Jews. And so again, you have wise men from the east, you have extravagant gifts, gold, frankincense, myrrh. You even have Herod's court in the story. So again, that the action is taking place at a high social status. And this says something about who Matthew thinks Jesus is. When we turn to Luke, though, it's interesting that the cast of characters is really quite different. And again, this is reflecting Luke's own particular interests. Luke is very keen to show that Jesus has come for the poor and marginalised. So the central focus of his birth story is now the mother of Jesus, Mary. She's a poor peasant girl, and it's to her that the angel Gabriel appears. All the way through the story, too, we have the impression that Jesus is there for the lowest in society. He goes to Bethlehem and there's no space for them in the inn, so he has to be born in the manger with the animals, presumably. And of course, the first people to see the baby in Luke's Gospel aren't magi from the east, but they're shepherds, poor lowly people. And so I think it's interesting that both in their own way, Matthew and Luke have perfectly presented a story of the birth of Jesus that's later going to shadow the kind of person he's going to be as a man.